The crystal chandelier above cast prismatic shadows across the polished marble floor of my parents' ballroom as I watched my younger sister Camila command the room's attention. Her champagne flute caught the light as she gestured dramatically, her voice carrying that theatrical quality she'd perfected over the years. Oh, and then Isabella tells us she single-handedly prevented an international incident. Camila's laugh tinkled through the air like breaking glass. The gathered relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins I saw only at these obligatory events, turned their heads between us like spectators at a tennis match. Can you imagine? Our Isabella, international woman of mystery. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My fingers tightened around my own glass, the cool crystal warming under my grip. I forced my expression to remain neutral, the way I'd learned during countless hours of interrogation training. But inside, something sharp and familiar twisted in my chest. The same sensation I'd felt during those lonely nights in foreign safe houses, knowing that no matter what I sacrificed, no one would ever truly understand. "Camila," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the ambient chatter. "That's enough." But she was just getting started. She set down her glass and began pacing in front of the gathered crowd, her designer heels clicking against the marble with each step. At 28, Camila had perfected the art of being the center of attention, something she had cultivated since childhood, while I was away at military academies and later deployed to places I couldn't name. No, let me finish this story," she continued, her dark eyes glittering with malicious amusement. So, Isabella claims she was in some undisclosed location, because of course it's always undisclosed, and she had to make the split-second decision that saved hundreds of lives. Doesn't that sound familiar? Like every action movie you've ever seen? Uncle Miguel, my father's younger brother, chuckled and shook his head. "Mija, you watch too much television," he said to me with a patronizing smile. "Intelligence work isn't like the movies." The irony wasn't lost on me. If only he knew that the movies got it all wrong. There was no glamour in the sand-filled nights, no orchestral soundtrack during the moments when split-second decisions meant the difference between diplomatic relations and international warfare. There was only silence, protocol, and the weight of secrets that pressed against your ribs until breathing became a conscious effort. "Tell them about the one in Prague," Camila said. "Or was it Budapest? It's so hard to keep track of Isabella's European adventures." My mother, Elena, appeared at my elbow, her hand finding my arm in that gentle way she'd always used to de-escalate tension. "Camila, perhaps we should talk about something else," she suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. This was her pattern. Smooth over the sharp edges, avoid confrontation, keep the peace at any cost. "But Mom, these stories are so entertaining. Like the time Isabella said she had to decode some urgent message while bullets were flying around her head. I mean, who does she think she's kidding?" My father, Harold, emerged from a cluster of his old military colleagues, his posture rigid with the bearing of a retired colonel. His gray hair was perfectly groomed, his suit immaculate, and his expression carried that familiar mixture of disappointment and embarrassment that I have grown accustomed to over the years. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded troops. But his next words weren't directed at Camila. They were aimed squarely at me. "Isabella, this is a family gathering, not story time. Perhaps it's time to stop with the fantasies." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my carefully constructed composure crack just slightly around the edges. These weren't fantasies. These were fragments of a life I had lived in shadows, pieces of truth I could share only in the vaguest terms because of the non-disclosure agreements I'd signed. Every scar on my body told a story I couldn't speak aloud, every night sleepless haunted by decisions that would never make headlines. Cousin Anna laughed nervously. Isabella has always been dramatic, she said to the woman beside her, not bothering to lower her voice. Remember when we were kids? She'd come back from summer camp with these elaborate tales about survival training. That wasn't summer camp, I said quietly, but my voice was lost in the rising chatter as the conversation moved away from me, the way conversations always did once my credibility was dismissed. I watched as Camila basked in the attention, accepting compliments on her wit and realism. She'd built her identity on being the sister who kept it real, who called out exaggeration and pretense wherever she found it. What she didn't understand was that sometimes the truth was so extraordinary it sounded like fiction. The ballroom suddenly felt suffocating. The laughter grew louder, the crystal chandelier seemed to spin, and I could taste the metallic tang of humiliation on my tongue. I set down my glass and moved toward the French doors that led to the garden, needing air, needing space, needing to be anywhere but surrounded by people who loved me but would never believe me. As I stepped into the cool Virginia evening, I could still hear Camila's voice floating through the open doors. She'll probably say she's on a secret mission tomorrow. I closed my eyes and let the night air fill my lungs. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter passed overhead, a sound that once would have made me instinctively check for cover. Now, it just reminded me of how far I was from the life I'd actually lived, trapped in a suburban world that felt more foreign than any overseas assignment ever had. The silence of my apartment pressed against me like a heavy blanket as I sat in my leather armchair, still wearing the dress I'd chosen so carefully for tonight's reunion. The taste of humiliation lingered bitter on my tongue, mixing with the remnants of champagne and the metallic edge of suppressed anger. I pulled the pins from my hair, letting it fall in waves around my shoulders, and tried to shake off the evening's events. But my mind wouldn't let go. It drifted, as it often did during moments like these, back to a place where my word wasn't questioned, where my decisions carried weight that could shift the balance of international relations. The desert night was impossibly cold, the kind of cold that seeps through Kevlar and tactical gear to settle deep in your bones. Marcus and I crouched behind a concrete barrier that had seen better days, its surface pockmarked with bullet holes from previous conflicts. The city sprawled below us, a maze of narrow streets and flat-roofed buildings that looked deceptively peaceful under the starlight. Intel confirms 3 diplomatic vehicles will pass through the intersection at 0200 hours, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible through the comm unit. His eyes never left the scope of his rifle as he scanned the shadows below. If the intercepted communications are accurate, someone's planning to turn tomorrow's peace talks into a bloodbath. I adjusted my position, feeling the familiar weight of my sidearm against my hip. 3 months of surveillance had led to this moment. 3 months of piecing together fragments of conversations, tracking financial transactions, and building relationships with sources who spoke in whispers and met only in crowded marketplaces. 2 vehicles approaching from the north, I reported, watching through my binoculars as headlights cut through the darkness. Timing's perfect. Too perfect. Marcus glanced at me and I could see the question in his eyes. We had perhaps 90 seconds to decide whether to abort or proceed. The intelligence suggested an ambush, but intelligence was often wrong. If we were mistaken, we'd blow 3 years of diplomatic progress. If we were right and did nothing, 3 ambassadors would die before morning. Your call, Taurus, Marcus said quietly. He trusted my instincts the way my family never had. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, running through every piece of information we'd gathered, every source we'd cultivated, every detail that had brought us to this rooftop. Then I opened them and keyed my radio. Phoenix Base, this is Nightingale. We have a code red situation. Need immediate diplomatic vehicle rerouting. Recommend alternate route through checkpoint 7. Nightingale, confirm code red. You're certain. I watched the vehicles below, my heart hammering against my ribs. Confirmed. Lives at stake. 20 minutes later, we watched from our position as an IED detonated at the exact intersection where the diplomatic convoy would have been. The explosion lit up the night sky, and I felt Marcus's hand briefly squeeze my shoulder. Good call, he said simply. But there would be no medals for that decision, no recognition, no story I could ever tell at family dinners. Just another classified report in a file somewhere, another secret added to the collection I carried like stones in my chest.
I opened my eyes, back in my apartment, back in the present where such decisions were dismissed as fantasy. On my coffee table sat a framed photo from that deployment. Marcus and me with our unit, faces carefully obscured for security reasons, standing in front of a helicopter that had taken us to places most people couldn't find on a map. Rising from my chair, I walked to my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser. Beneath layers of sweaters and workout clothes, my fingers found the small wooden box I kept hidden there. Inside were the few tangible reminders of my service that I was allowed to keep. A bronze star I'd never displayed, a purple heart from the injury that ended my field career, and several commendation letters with most of the text blacked out for classification reasons. I picked up the purple heart, feeling its weight in my palm. The injury had happened during my final deployment, a piece of shrapnel from a car bomb that had torn through my left shoulder and ended my career in the field. I'd spent 6 months in recovery, followed by a reassignment to analysis work in D.C., a transition that felt like exile, even though I understood the reasoning behind it. "You've given enough," my commanding officer had said during my final debriefing. "Time to let others take the risks." But the analysis work, while important, felt abstract compared to the visceral reality of field operations. I spent my days now reviewing satellite imagery, parsing intercepted communications, and writing reports that would influence policy decisions I'd never see implemented. It was vital work, but it was work I could never explain to my family in terms they'd find believable. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling me from my reverie. A text message from Marcus. "You might want to turn on the news tomorrow. Something big is happening." I frowned at the cryptic message. Marcus had transitioned to private sector work after his military service, contracting with various government agencies. He stayed connected to circles,
No longer moved in, privy to information that sometimes filtered down to me through unofficial channels. I typed back, "Care to elaborate?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "Can't say much over text, but remember that conversation we had about recognition for the work we did? Someone higher up might be listening." My pulse quickened. For years, there had been occasional discussions in intelligence circles about declassifying certain operations, particularly those that had prevented rather than caused international incidents. The theory was that public recognition of successful preventative intelligence could help rebuild trust in the agencies, demonstrating their value beyond the covert operations that sometimes made headlines for the wrong reasons. But it had always remained theoretical, the kind of policy discussion that happened in conference rooms and never translated to actual action. The intelligence community was built on secrecy, and secrecy was a habit that died hard. I set the purple heart back in the drawer and closed the drawer, but Marcus's message stayed with me as I prepared for bed. Outside my window, the city hummed with its usual nighttime energy, but for the first time in months, I felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Tomorrow's news. Something big is happening. Someone higher up listening. I thought about Camilla's laughter, about my father's dismissive words, about the way my family had turned my service into entertainment. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe someone was finally listening. The morning sunlight filtered through my apartment's sheer curtains as I sat at my kitchen counter, nursing my second cup of coffee and scrolling through news headlines on my tablet. Most of the stories were the usual political theater: budget discussions, international trade disputes, the kind of policy debates that had become white noise in Washington's daily rhythm. Then I saw it. Defense Department announces major declassification initiative. My finger hovered over the headline for a moment before tapping it. The article loaded slowly, and I found myself holding my breath as I read the opening paragraphs. Defense Secretary Evelyn Grant announced yesterday that the Pentagon will begin declassifying select intelligence operations from the past decade, focusing on what she termed preventative successes that safeguarded American interests without compromising ongoing security protocols. The American people deserve to understand the dedication and sacrifice of the men and women who serve in our intelligence community, Secretary Grant stated during a press briefing. Too often we hear about intelligence failures, but we rarely celebrate the crises that never happened because of the swift action of our personnel. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands.
Evelyn Grant had been a mid-level Pentagon official during some of my deployments, but she'd risen quickly through the ranks. A sharp, no-nonsense administrator who understood both the political and practical aspects of intelligence work. If anyone would push for recognition of unsung operations, it would be her. The article continued with the usual bureaucratic language about careful review processes and national security considerations, but buried in the third paragraph was a line that made my heart race. The initiative will focus particularly on operations that prevented diplomatic incidents, terrorist attacks, and other threats that could have resulted in significant loss of life. My phone rang, the sudden sound making me jump. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. "Tell me you're reading the news," he said without preamble when I answered. "I'm reading it." I carried the phone to my living room window, looking out at the morning traffic that moved through the city like blood through arteries. I think you should be prepared for some changes," Marcus interrupted. "I've been making some calls this morning. Word is that Grant personally reviewed the list of operations being considered for declassification." I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. That doesn't mean anything. There were dozens of successful operations during that period. "Isabella," Marcus's voice carried the patient tone he'd used during our deployments when he needed me to focus. "I know you've gotten used to being invisible, but you were involved in some of the most significant preventative operations of the decade. The Prague situation alone saved 3 diplomatic missions and potentially prevented a regional conflict." Prague. I'd never told my family about Prague, not in any detail. How could I explain that I spent 2 weeks embedded with a criminal organization, gathering intelligence that led to the disruption of an arms deal that would have supplied weapons to 3 different terrorist groups? How could I describe the moment when I'd realized the scope of what we'd uncovered, the way my hands had shaken as I transmitted the coordinates that led to the largest weapon seizure in European history? "Even if they declassify some operations," I said carefully, "that doesn't mean they'll release personnel information." "No," Marcus agreed, "but it's a start." And Isabella, Grant specifically mentioned recognizing unsung heroes. That sounds personal to me. After we hung up, I found myself pacing my apartment with a restless energy I hadn't felt in months. For so long, I'd accepted that my service would remain invisible, that my sacrifices would be known only to the handful of people who'd been there. I'd built my identity around that silence, learned to find satisfaction in work that would never be acknowledged. But now, faced with the possibility of recognition, I discovered that I wanted it more than I'd admitted to myself. Not for glory or validation, but for the simple human need to be seen and understood by the people I loved. My mother called just after lunch, her voice carrying that carefully cheerful tone she used when she was trying to smooth over conflict. "Mija, I hope you're not still upset about last night," she began. "You know how Camila gets when she's had a few glasses of wine. She didn't mean anything by it." "Didn't she?" I found myself asking. The morning's news had shifted something inside me, made me less willing to simply accept the family's casual dismissal of my experiences. "Isabella, please, you know how much we all love you, but you have to understand, some of the stories you tell, they're so dramatic. It's hard to believe that our quiet, serious Isabella was involved in all these international adventures." Quiet, serious Isabella. The daughter who'd never caused trouble, who'd followed orders, who'd sacrificed her youth and her peace of mind in service to her country. The daughter who'd come home with a purple heart and a shoulder that still ached in cold weather, only to discover that her family saw her as a fantasist. "What if I told you that some of those stories might be proven true very soon?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" "The Defense Department is declassifying some intelligence operations. It's possible that some of my work might be included." "Oh, mija," my mother's sigh carried across the phone line. "You can't keep building these elaborate explanations for your stories. If you worked on important government projects, don't you think we would have heard about them by now?" The conversation ended with my mother inviting me to dinner on Sunday, encouraging me to let bygones be bygones with Camila. I agreed, though part of me wondered if that would be the last family dinner where I had to smile and stay silent while my service was treated as elaborate fiction. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing satellite imagery for my current assignment, monitoring territorial disputes in the South China Sea that most Americans would never hear about. The work required the same analytical skills I developed during my field years, the same attention to detail that had saved lives in places whose names were classified. As I worked, my mind kept drifting to the morning's news, to Marcus's cautious optimism, to the possibility that the invisible might finally become visible. Outside my window, the city lights twinkled like distant stars, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine what it might feel like to tell my family the truth, not fragments and careful omissions, but the whole truth about who I'd been and what I'd done in service to something larger than myself. The recognition might never come. The declassification process was notoriously slow and often resulted in documents so heavily redacted they told no story at all. But the possibility existed now, floating in the space between secrecy and revelation, like a promise that hadn't quite been made. I saved my work and closed my laptop, but I didn't turn off the desk lamp. Instead, I sat in its circle of light, listening to the city's nighttime symphony and waiting for tomorrow's news. Sunday dinner at my parents' house had always been a ritual of forced togetherness, but as I pulled into the circular driveway of their Virginia Colonial, I felt the familiar knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The house looked exactly as it had during my childhood: pristine white columns, perfectly manicured hedges, the kind of suburban perfection that suggested secrets were kept behind closed doors and difficult conversations were smoothed over with good manners. Elena met me at the door with the kind of overly bright smile that meant she'd been worrying about tonight's dinner since our phone conversation. "Isabella, mija, I'm so glad you came. I made your favorite, arroz con pollo." The smell of saffron and garlic filled the entrance hall, mixing with the scent of my mother's jasmine perfume. She kissed my cheek, her hands lingering on my shoulders in that maternal way that was supposed to be comforting, but felt more like an anchor trying to keep me from drifting away from the family narrative she'd constructed. "Where's everyone else?" I asked, though I could already hear voices coming from the dining room, the particular pitch of laughter that meant Camila was holding court. "Your father's opening wine, and Camila brought some friends from her yoga class. I hope you don't mind. I thought it might be nice to have some fresh faces around the table." Fresh faces. Witnesses, more likely. My mother's conflict-avoidant tendencies had evolved into a strategy of diluting tension with the presence of outsiders, as if bad behavior was less likely to surface in front of strangers. The dining room buzzed with conversation as we entered. Harold stood at the head of the mahogany table that had been in our family for 3 generations, wrestling with a wine cork while Camila regaled 3 young women with what appeared to be another theatrical performance. Her hands moved through the air like a conductor orchestrating an invisible symphony, and her audience laughed at perfectly timed intervals. "And then she tells us she had to jump off a building," Camila was saying, her voice pitched to carry across the room. "I mean, who does she think she is, some kind of action hero?" One of her friends, a blonde with the kind of sculpted features that suggested expensive orthodontia and regular Botox appointments, giggled and shook her head. "Oh my God, that's like when my cousin claims he was almost recruited by the CIA because he speaks 3 languages." "Right?" Camila's eyes found mine across the room, and I saw the familiar glitter of malicious amusement. Isabella has these elaborate stories about international missions and coded messages. It's like she's living in some spy novel fantasy. My father finally managed to extract the cork from the wine bottle, the pop echoing through the dining room like a small explosion. "Isabella," he said without looking at me, "come sit down. We're just about to eat." I took my usual seat, the one that faced the kitchen, positioned so I could help my mother serve when needed. It was a strategic placement I'd never questioned until I realized how it symbolized my role in the family. useful, supportive, but ultimately peripheral to the real drama happening at the other end of the table. As Elena served the arroz con pollo, I tried to focus on the familiar comfort of her cooking, but Camila's voice kept cutting through my concentration. "Tell them about the one where you had to decode some urgent message while under fire," she said, her tone dripping with theatrical encouragement. "That's my personal favorite. It has all the elements: danger, mystery, international intrigue." The blonde friend leaned forward, her eyes wide with the kind of fascination reserved for particularly entertaining fiction. "Wait, you actually tell people you were in combat situations?" "Isabella has quite the imagination," Uncle Miguel said, appearing in the doorway with his wife Carmen. I hadn't heard them arrive, but they often joined Sunday dinners without invitation, family privilege that came with being Harold's younger brother. Government job. That's how they'd categorized 8 years of military intelligence service, reducing my entire career to something vague and bureaucratic, easily dismissed and quickly forgotten. "It's not imagination," I said quietly, but my voice was lost in the rising chatter as more family members arrived, cousins I rarely saw except at holidays, their children running through the house with the kind of energy that made adult conversation impossible to maintain for more than 30 seconds at a time. Camila stood up, tapping her wine glass with her knife to get everyone's attention. "I think we should have Isabella tell one of her stories for our guests. They've never heard about her secret agent days." The room fell into the kind of expectant silence that precedes either a performance or an execution. I could feel every eye on me, waiting for entertainment, for the show that had apparently become my role in family gatherings. "Camila," Elena said softly, her voice carrying a plea for peace, "perhaps we should just enjoy dinner." "No, it's fine, Mom." Camila's smile had sharp edges. "Isabella loves being the center of attention, don't you, sis? Tell them about the time you single-handedly prevented a terrorist attack. Or was it the one where you decoded enemy communications just in time to save a diplomatic mission?" The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to sound ridiculous when stripped of context and classified details. She was taking fragments of conversations I'd shared years ago, conversations from back when I'd still hoped my family might understand the weight of what I'd carried, and turning them into punchlines. "Those aren't stories," I said, my voice steady despite the way my hands were shaking under the table. "I'm trying to respect the non-disclosure agreements I signed when I took an oath to serve my country." Camila laughed, the sound sharp and brittle in the suddenly tense dining room. "Oh, please. You were a data analyst for the Defense Department. You weren't James Bond." The room erupted in uncomfortable laughter, the kind that happens when people don't know how else to respond to rising tension. I saw Elena's face crumple with disappointment, saw Harold's jaw tighten with embarrassment, saw the yoga friends exchange glances that suggested they were witnessing more family drama than they'd bargained for. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I need some air." As I walked toward the French doors that led to the garden, I heard Camilla's voice behind me, pitched just loud enough to ensure I couldn't miss it. "She'll probably claim she's going to make a classified phone call." The laughter that followed me outside felt like a physical weight pressing against my shoulders. I stood in the garden where I'd played as a child, surrounded by the jasmine bushes my mother had planted when we first moved to this house, and tried to remember why I kept subjecting myself to these gatherings. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number with a government prefix. "File to be released within 48 hours. Prepare yourself." I stared at the message, my heart hammering against my ribs. 48 hours. In less than 2 days, the truth I'd been carrying like a stone in my chest for years may finally see daylight. Inside the house, I could hear the dinner conversation resuming, the laughter getting louder as the wine flowed, and my absence made it easier to dismiss me as the family's dramatic storyteller. But for the first time in years, I didn't care what they thought. In 48 hours, everything was going to change. The Pentagon's James S. Brady press briefing room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major announcement. As I sat in my apartment, remote control clutched in my sweaty palm. I'd called in sick to work, something I'd done perhaps 3 times in my entire career, because I couldn't focus on anything except the possibility that my invisible life was about to become visible. On my coffee table sat my laptop, open to 3 different news websites, my phone displaying a live feed from C-SPAN, and a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. I'd been awake since 4 a.m., my mind cycling between anticipation and terror in a loop that made my hands shake and my stomach clench. Defense Secretary Evelyn Grant stepped up to the podium at exactly 2 p.m., her bearing as commanding as I'd remembered from the few times I'd seen her during my service years. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her navy suit spoke of authority earned through decades of navigating Washington's treacherous political waters. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying clearly through my apartment's speakers. "Today, the Department of Defense is taking an unprecedented step in recognizing the often invisible sacrifices made by our intelligence personnel." I leaned forward, my heart hammering so loudly I was afraid I might miss something crucial. "Over the past decade, there have been numerous instances where the swift action of our intelligence operatives prevented international crises that could have resulted in significant loss of life and destabilization of key diplomatic relationships. Today, we are declassifying select operations to honor those who served in the shadows." The screen filled with an official Department of Defense seal as Secretary Grant continued. "The first operation we're recognizing occurred 3 years ago in Eastern Europe. An intelligence officer, identified in our records as Officer IT, infiltrated an arms trafficking network and provided intelligence that prevented weapons from reaching 3 different terrorist organizations." Officer IT. My breath caught in my throat. The Prague operation. I could still remember the weight of the concealed recording device taped to my ribs, the way my pulse had thundered in my ears as I'd sat across from arms dealers who spoke casually about selling weapons that would kill innocent people. The intelligence gathered by Officer IT led to the largest weapons seizure in European history and disrupted planned attacks in 4 different countries. This individual's work quite literally saved hundreds of lives. My phone rang, Marcus's name flashing on the screen. I answered without taking my eyes off the television. "Are you watching this?" he asked, his voice tight with excitement. "Officer IT," I whispered. "They're talking about Prague." "Isabella, that's you. They're talking about you." On screen, Secretary Grant was describing the second operation, something I recognized as the desert incident that had haunted my flashbacks, the one where I weighed the split-second decision to reroute the diplomatic convoy. In this case, Officer IT's analysis of intercepted communications and subsequent recommendations to alter diplomatic security protocols prevented an assassination attempt that would have killed 3 ambassadors and likely triggered a regional conflict. The room around me seemed to tilt sideways. Years of carrying these secrets, years of having my experiences dismissed as fantasy, and now they were being described in clinical, official language on national television. "Who is Officer IT?" a reporter called out from the audience. "Due to ongoing security considerations, we cannot release personnel information at this time. However, I can say that this individual exemplifies the dedication, sacrifice that characterize our intelligence community." Their service continued despite sustaining injuries in the line of duty, and they have continued to serve our nation in an analytical capacity. My shoulder throbbed, as if responding to the mention of my injury, the shrapnel wound that had ended my field career, the Purple Heart that sat hidden in my dresser drawer, the physical reminder of the price I'd paid for service. "Marcus," I said into the phone, "what does this mean?" "It means someone very high up decided you deserved recognition," he replied. "Grant doesn't do anything without careful consideration. If she's declassifying your operations, it's because she believes the public needs to know." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment's silence, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Somewhere in my family's suburban neighborhood, people were probably watching the same press conference, hearing the same descriptions of heroism and sacrifice. But would they make the connection? Would they recognize that Officer IT and their dramatic storyteller daughter were the same person? My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Are you watching the news? They're talking about some intelligence officer who did amazing things. Reminds me of your stories." The emoji felt like a small knife twist. Even presented with official confirmation, my mother was still trading my experiences like entertaining fiction, just with better production values. But then another text came in, this one from Camila. "This still proves nothing. They didn't say your name." I stared at her message, understanding that she'd made the connection, but was still unwilling to admit she might be wrong. That stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality was so perfectly Camila. Double down on skepticism even when faced with contradictory evidence. And the rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of phone calls from colleagues who'd watched the press conference, emails from former teammates offering congratulations, and a strange, hollow feeling that this recognition had come too late to repair the damage done by years of disbelief. I found myself pacing my apartment, energy coursing through me with nowhere to go. For so long, I'd imagined what this moment might feel like. Vindication, satisfaction, the sweet taste of being proven right. But the reality was more complex, layered with years of hurt that wouldn't simply disappear because of an official announcement. That evening, I sat at my kitchen window watching the sun set over the city, my reflection ghost-like in the glass. Tomorrow, the news cycle will move on to other stories. The brief spotlight on intelligence heroism would fade back into the shadows where such work usually resided. But for today, for this moment, the truth had been spoken aloud by someone with the authority to make people listen. My phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Ms. Torres." The voice was crisp, professional, unmistakably military. "This is Colonel Davidson from the Secretary's office. Secretary Grant would like to speak with you personally. Would tomorrow at 3 p.m. be convenient?" I gripped the phone tighter, my knees suddenly weak. "Yes," I managed. "Yes, that would be fine." "Excellent. And Miss Torres, the Secretary asked me to tell you that your country is grateful for your service, and she's honored to finally give you the recognition you've earned." After I hung up, I sat down hard on my kitchen stool, the weight of the day's events finally settling into my bones. Tomorrow, I will speak with the Defense Secretary. Tomorrow, the invisible might become fully visible. But tonight, I was still caught between two worlds. The shadows where I'd served, and the light where truth was finally being spoken aloud. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that the light might win. The call from Secretary Grant's office had left me pacing my apartment until well past midnight, my mind cycling between disbelief and a dangerous flutter of hope. I'd tried to prepare for the conversation, had even written down questions I might want to ask, but when my phone rang at precisely 3 p.m. the following day, all my careful preparation evaporated. "Ms. Torres, thank you for taking my call." Secretary Grant's voice carried the same authority I remembered from yesterday's press conference. But there was something warmer in her tone now, more personal. "I wanted to speak with you directly before we take the next step." The next step? I found myself standing at attention in my living room, old military habits asserting themselves even during a phone call. "We're releasing the names behind the declassified operations. Your name will be at the top of the list, along with the specific operations you were involved in. I wanted you to hear this from me personally before it hits the news cycle."
Captain. No one had called me by my rank in years, not since my medical discharge from field operations. Hearing it now, spoken with respect by one of the most powerful people in the Defense Department, made something inside my chest crack open. "Ma'am," I said, my voice hoarse, "may I ask why now? Why these operations? Why my name?" "Because I was there for 2 of your debriefings, Captain Torres. I watched you deliver intelligence that saved lives, and I watched you accept reassignment after your injury without complaint. I've spent my career in this bureaucracy, and I've seen too many good people disappear into the shadows without recognition.
Her voice hardened slightly. The intelligence community has a problem with public trust. People need to see that we do more than spy on foreign governments. Sometimes we prevent wars. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment's silence, trying to process what was about to happen. In a matter of hours, my name would be associated with classified operations. My service record would become public knowledge, and the invisible life I'd led for nearly a decade would be exposed to scrutiny from family, friends, and strangers alike. My phone started buzzing almost immediately with calls from reporters. I let them all go to voicemail, but their messages painted a picture of the media frenzy that was building. Hero intelligence officer, the spy next door, local woman's secret life of international intrigue. By 6 p.m., there were news vans parked outside my apartment building. I stood at my gesturing toward my building as she spoke into a microphone. Marcus appeared at my door 30 minutes later, carrying takeout bags and wearing the kind of grim expression that meant he'd had to navigate through the media circus downstairs. Thai food and moral support, he announced, setting the bags on my kitchen counter. Also, I may have told that reporter from Channel 7 that you were out of town. Sorry, not sorry. We ate pad thai while watching the evening news, which led with my story. There I was on screen, my official military photo from 8 years ago, looking young and serious in dress uniform, followed by recent footage of my apartment building and breathless commentary about the intelligence officer who prevented international crises. It's surreal, I said, watching a terrorism expert explain the significance of the Prague arms seizure, seeing my work described by people who've never been in the field, who've never had to make those kinds of decisions. How does it feel? Marcus asked. After all these years of silence, of being dismissed, how does it feel to have your service acknowledged publicly? I considered the question, trying to sort through the complex mix of emotions churning in my chest. Validating, I said finally, but also terrifying. What if this changes everything? What if people expect me to be someone I'm not? You mean someone other than the person who prevented terrorist attacks and diplomatic incidents? Marcus raised an eyebrow. Isabella, you've been that person all along. The only difference is that now other people get to know it too. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Mija, is this you on the news? They're saying Isabella Torres, and they're showing a photo that looks like you, but the stories they're telling, are these the stories you've been telling us? Then another text from Harold. Call me immediately. And finally, inevitably, a message from Camila. I don't understand what's happening. Call me. I showed Marcus the messages, and he whistled low. Your family's about to have a very interesting evening. They still don't believe it, I said, staring at Camila's text. Even with official confirmation, even with my name and photo on the news, they still can't accept that their quiet, dramatic Isabella might have actually lived the life she described. Marcus set down his chopsticks and looked at me seriously. Some people would rather cling to their version of reality than accept that they might have been wrong. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before I could answer, my phone rang. Harold's name on the display. Dad, I answered. Isabella. His voice was strained, carrying an emotion I couldn't quite identify. I need you to explain to me what's happening on the news. They're showing your photograph, using your name, talking about military operations and classified missions. They're talking about my service record, Dad, the work I did before I was injured. There was a long pause. The stories you've been telling us, they were real? Yes. Another pause, longer this time. All of them? The ones I was allowed to share? Yes. There were others I couldn't discuss. I heard him take a shaky breath. Isabella, I owe you an apology. We all do. I thought you were exaggerating, trying to make your government work sound more exciting than it was.
I know what you thought, Dad. How do we fix this? He asked. And for the first time in years, my father sounded uncertain.
vulnerable in a way that reminded me of being a child when he didn't have all the answers. I don't know that we can, I said honestly. 8 years of being dismissed, of having my experiences treated as fantasy, that doesn't disappear overnight because of a news story. After I hung up, Marcus and I sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle beyond my windows. The media circus outside had quieted, but I knew tomorrow would bring fresh attention, more questions, more scrutiny of a life I'd kept private for so long. "What happens now?" I asked. Marcus smiled, the expression mixing pride and affection. "Now you get to decide who you want to be in the light instead of the shadows, and you get to do it on your terms." Outside, a helicopter passed overhead. No longer a sound that made me check for cover, but a reminder that somewhere out there, others were doing the work I'd once done, carrying secrets that might someday see the light of day. For the first time in years, that thought didn't fill me with loneliness, it filled me with hope. 3 days after my name hit the news, my parents' house buzzed with a different kind of energy. The same relatives who had dismissed my stories now gathered in the living room, their voices carrying a mixture of awe and awkward guilt. I arrived fashionably late, a power move Marcus had suggested, and found the family dynamic completely transformed. Uncle Miguel, who had laughed at my movie fantasies just weeks ago, practically leapt from his chair when I entered. "Isabella, mija, we saw you on CNN. We had no idea. I mean, we knew you worked for the government, but this..." He gestured helplessly as if trying to encompass international heroism with his hands. Carmen grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with the kind of reverence usually reserved for celebrities. "Tell us about Prague. The news said you infiltrated an arms trafficking ring. Were you scared?" The questions came in a flood. The same relatives who had rolled their eyes at my elaborate tales now hung on every word, treating me like I'd stepped out of an action movie and into their suburban living room. The irony wasn't lost on me that official validation had transformed fantasy into fact in their minds. "Isabella's always been modest about her accomplishments," Elena said, beaming with maternal pride that felt both gratifying and hollow. Where had this pride been when I'd needed it most? I caught sight of Camila in the corner, perched on the piano bench with her arms crossed, watching the family fawn over me with an expression that mixed disbelief with something darker. She'd been uncharacteristically quiet since I arrived, her usual wit replaced by a brittle silence that made everyone nervous. Harold approached with measured steps, his military bearing more pronounced than usual. "Isabella," he said formally, then surprised me by extending a crisp salute. "Captain Torres, I owe you an apology." The gesture was so unexpected, so publicly demonstrative from a man who rarely showed emotion, that the room fell silent. I returned the salute automatically, muscle memory from years of service overriding my surprise. "I was wrong," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Your country honored you, and I should have trusted that you'd earned that honor." The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy and meaningful. But even as warmth spread through my chest, I noticed what he hadn't said, that he should have trusted me, his daughter, regardless of official confirmation. "Tell them about the diplomatic convoy," Cousin Anna urged. "The news said you saved 3 ambassadors." Before I could respond, Camila's voice cut through the reverent atmosphere like a blade. "This is unbelievable." Every head turned toward her. She stood up from the piano bench, her composure finally cracking. "Are we all just going to pretend this is normal? That our Isabella was living this secret agent life while we sat here thinking she was making it all up?" "Camila," Elena warned softly. "No, Mom. This is insane." Camila's voice rose, years of resentment bubbling to the surface. "She gets to be the hero, the special one, the one with the mysterious past. And what do I get? I get to be the sister who didn't believe her." The raw pain in her voice surprised me. Beneath the cruelty and mockery, I glimpsed something I'd never considered. That perhaps Camila's dismissal of my stories hadn't just been about disbelief. Perhaps it had been about feeling overshadowed by a sister whose life seemed impossibly dramatic compared to her own ordinary existence.
"You could have just told us the truth," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I couldn't," I replied quietly. "Non-disclosure agreements exist for a reason. Lives depend on operational security."
Lives, she repeated bitterly. Everything's always life and death with you, isn't it? Even now, even when you've been vindicated, you can't just be normal. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. My experiences had changed me, left me unable to relate to the concerns that occupied most people's daily lives. How could I care about social media drama when I'd seen what real stakes looked like? Uncle Miguel cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps we should focus on celebrating Isabella's achievements. But Camila wasn't finished. You know what the worst part is? I actually started to believe you were making it up because I wanted you to be making it up. Because if you weren't, it meant I'd spent years mocking someone who'd risked her life for strangers. The admission hung between us, raw and unexpected. For the first time since childhood, I saw my sister clearly. Not as the golden child or the family antagonist, but as someone struggling with her own sense of inadequacy in the shadow of a sister whose accomplishments she couldn't understand or compete with. "Camila," I started. "No," she cut me off, grabbing her purse from the coffee table. "I need some air. I need to think about who I've been and what that says about me." She left the room in a rush, the front door slamming behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. The family sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure how to process this new crack in the narrative they'd been constructing about heroic Isabella's triumphant return. But I found myself following her outside, drawn by something in her voice that I recognized, the sound of someone whose worldview had just collapsed, leaving them scrambling to understand who they were in the ruins. The black sedan pulling up to my parents' house 20 minutes later caused a stir that rippled through the neighborhood. I watched from the front porch, where I'd been sitting with Camila, both of us wrapped in the awkward silence that follows emotional revelation, as neighbors emerged from houses to peer at the official vehicle with government plates. Defense Secretary Evelyn Grant stepped out with the kind of practiced poise that comes from decades of high-stakes meetings. She wore a navy suit that spoke of authority, and her silver hair caught the late afternoon sunlight as she approached the house. Behind her, an aide carried a leather portfolio that looked important enough to contain state secrets. "Captain Torres," she said, extending her hand as I rose from the porch steps, "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. I was in the area and wanted to personally deliver something that's long overdue." Harold appeared in the doorway, having spotted the official car from the living room window. His eyes widened as he recognized the defense secretary, and I watched 25 years of military protocol snap him to attention. "Secretary Grant," he said, his voice carrying the kind of respect that had been absent when he dismissed my stories as fantasy. "Colonel Torres," she replied, acknowledging his retired rank. "I've come to speak with your family about Isabella's service. May I come in?" The living room fell silent as we entered, every family member frozen in tableau like actors who'd forgotten their lines. Secretary Grant's presence transformed the suburban space into something that felt almost governmental, her authority filling the room like a low-frequency hum that demanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room, "I'm here because Captain Torres has spent nearly a decade carrying the weight of classified service without recognition from the people who matter most to her, her family." She gestured to her aide, who opened the leather portfolio and withdrew several official documents. "The operations I described at the press conference represent only a fraction of your daughter's contributions to national security. Due to classification levels, there are missions I cannot discuss publicly, successes that will remain invisible to protect ongoing operations and the lives of assets still in the field." Elena's hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide with dawning comprehension. How many missions? In her 8 years of active service, Captain Torres participated in 47 operations across 6 continents. 15 of those operations were classified at the highest levels due to their sensitive nature. Secretary Grant's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on each family member. the Prague arms interdiction that made headlines, that was her 13th successful infiltration. The number hit me like a physical blow. 13. I'd never counted them myself, had tried not to think about the cumulative weight of identities assumed, lies told, and dangers faced in service to missions I couldn't discuss. She was injured during Operation Blackwater, the secretary continued, and I felt my shoulder throb in response to the name that I hadn't heard spoken out loud in years. Shrapnel from an improvised explosive device. She continued the mission for 6 hours after sustaining the injury, ensuring the safe extraction of 4 intelligence assets before accepting medical attention. Harold's face had gone pale. 6 hours?
The Purple Heart citation specifically mentions her extraordinary heroism under enemy fire, Secretary Grant said, withdrawing another document from the portfolio. But due to the classified nature of the operation, the award ceremony was private, attended only by her immediate commanding officers. I remembered that ceremony, a sterile conference room in a military hospital, my arm in a sling, accepting recognition from men whose names I was never allowed to mention. I'd told my family I'd received a commendation, but they'd never asked to see it, never inquired about the details. Secretary Grant turned to address me directly. "Captain, the intelligence community has a debt to you that can never be fully repaid. But today, I can offer something that should have been provided years ago: public recognition from someone with the authority to speak for your country." She withdrew a final document from the portfolio, this one bearing the official seal of the Defense Department. "By executive order, you are hereby awarded the Intelligence Star for exceptionally meritorious service that resulted in the prevention of significant loss of civilian life and the preservation of critical diplomatic relationships." The room erupted in gasps and whispered prayers. Elena began crying openly, her hands pressed to her mouth as she stared at the medal Secretary Grant was now pinning to my blouse. Harold stood at rigid attention, his eyes bright with tears I'd never seen him shed. But it was Camilla's reaction that surprised me most. She'd moved from the doorway to stand directly beside me, her hand finding my uninjured shoulder as Secretary Grant spoke about sacrifice and service. When I looked at her, I saw not the mocking sister who'd dismissed my stories, but someone grappling with the reality of who I'd been while she'd been busy diminishing me. "I owe you an apology," she whispered, so quietly that only I could hear. "I owe you so much more than an apology." Secretary Grant concluded her remarks by addressing the family as a whole. "Your daughter, your sister, is a hero in the truest sense of the word. She served in silence, sacrificed her safety for strangers, and bore the weight of secrets that would have crushed lesser people. You should be immensely proud." As the secretary and her aide prepared to leave, Harold stepped forward with the kind of military bearing I remembered from my childhood. "Ma'am, thank you for bringing her home to us. We didn't understand what we had." "Now you do, Colonel. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" The days following Secretary Grant's visit unfolded like scenes from someone else's life. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, neighbors wanting to introduce themselves to the hero next door, and reporters seeking interviews about my transition from shadows to spotlight. But it was the changes within my immediate family that felt most surreal. Harold, who had spent years treating my service as elaborate fiction, now approached me with the kind of reverence typically reserved for war memorials. He asked careful questions about military protocol, sought my opinion on international affairs, and spoke about me to his veteran friends with unmistakable pride. "I've been telling the boys at the VFW about your commendations," he said during one of our newly frequent phone conversations. "Tom Martinez says his son works in intelligence, but nothing like what you did, nothing classified at your level." The pride in his voice was everything I'd once craved, but now it felt complicated,
layered with the bitter knowledge that it had taken official validation to earn what should have been freely given. I appreciated his efforts, but couldn't shake the feeling that his respect was conditional, dependent on external confirmation rather than trust in me. Elena's response was more complex, a mixture of maternal guilt and overcompensating affection. She called daily, usually in tears, alternating between apologies for not believing me and elaborate praise for my courage. During one particularly difficult conversation, she confessed her deepest fear. I kept telling myself you were exaggerating because I couldn't bear the thought that my baby girl was in danger. If I accepted that your stories were real, I'd have to accept that you could have been killed, and I wasn't strong enough for that truth. Her honesty was both heartbreaking and illuminating. For years, I'd interpreted her dismissal as lack of faith in me, but it had actually been a mother's desperate attempt to protect herself from imagining her daughter in mortal peril. Camilla's transformation was the most surprising. Gone was the mocking sister who'd built her identity on dismissing my experiences. In her place was someone struggling with genuine remorse, someone who seemed to be questioning everything she'd believed about herself and our relationship. She appeared at my apartment 3 days after Secretary Grant's visit, carrying coffee from my favorite cafe and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, humility mixed with something that might have been awe. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, settling onto my couch with the kind of careful movements that suggested she wasn't sure she was welcome, "about what Secretary Grant said, about the missions she couldn't discuss publicly." Camila,
No, let me say this. She set down her coffee and turned to face me fully. You've been carrying all of this alone. Years of secrets, years of having your family mock you for experiences you couldn't fully explain, and I was the worst of all of them. I studied her face, searching for traces of the sister who delighted in public humiliation, but found only genuine pain and what looked like the beginning of understanding. Why? I asked. Why was it so important to tear me down? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it contained answers. Because you were everything I wasn't. Disciplined, purposeful, important in ways I couldn't comprehend. And instead of admiring you for it, I convinced myself you were lying, because it was easier than feeling inadequate. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we should cross. For so many years, our relationship had been built on conflict, on her need to diminish me and my need to defend myself. Without that dynamic, we were left to discover who we might be to each other. I spent years mocking you for living in fantasy, but I'm the one who's been living in a fantasy. I created this version of you, dramatic, attention-seeking, unreliable, because it made me feel better about my own life. Marcus had been right when he'd said some people would rather cling to their version of reality than accept they'd been wrong. But Camila was proving him wrong by doing the harder thing, admitting error and trying to build something new from the rubble of old assumptions. "Where do we go from here?" I asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I can't undo years of being awful to you. I can't take back the mockery or the public humiliation, but maybe I can try to be the sister you deserved all along." That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing intelligence reports, the same kind of analytical work that had once felt like exile, but now seemed like a natural evolution of my service. Outside my window, the city hummed with its usual energy, but everything felt different now. The weight of secrets hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, become something shared rather than born alone. My phone buzzed with a text from Harold. "Proud of you, Captain. Always have been, even when I was too stubborn to show it." Another from Elena. "Dinner Sunday? Your choice of restaurant. Whatever my hero daughter wants." And finally, unexpectedly, one from Camila. "I'm going to spend some time figuring out how to be worthy of having a sister like you." Recognition, I was learning, was a complicated gift. It had given me vindication and family pride, but it had also revealed how conditional love could be, how quickly people could rewrite history to cast themselves in a better light. The applause felt hollow sometimes, coming from people who'd refused to clap when the music was playing softly. But perhaps that was okay. Perhaps the real victory wasn't in proving I'd been right all along, but in discovering I no longer needed their validation to know my own worth. The medals and commendations were nice, but the mission had always been larger than recognition. I was Isabella Torres, intelligence officer, keeper of secrets, protector of strangers. I had been these things before anyone acknowledged them, and I will continue to be them regardless of who chose to believe it. The truth had set me free, but not in the way I'd expected. It hadn't changed the past or erased years of dismissal. Instead, it had shown me that I'd never needed anyone else's permission to know who I was. 6 months later, I stood before my family at another gathering, but this time on my terms. The intelligent star gleamed in its frame on my mantelpiece, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of truths that existed long before anyone chose to believe them. I won't be silent anymore when questioned. My service wasn't performed for applause, but I won't allow it to be diminished either. Camila nodded, humbled. Harold stood straighter. Elena smiled through tears. Marcus squeezed my hand. Recognition hadn't made me real. It had simply revealed what was always there. I am Isabella Torres, intelligence officer, keeper of secrets, protector of strangers. I was these things before the world acknowledged them, and I will continue to be them regardless of who chose to believe it. The truth had finally set me free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.